Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com. On this episode, we are talking about the shifting challenges of data management and analysis with Michael Sims, VP of Digital Advisory and Data Analytics at Columbus Global. Mike is a veteran of the Dynamics AX space, now the Dynamics 365 space, and has been on the front lines with customers over that time as they have worked to get control of their business data and perform needed reporting and analysis. This episode is sponsored by Columbus Global, and Mike and I discuss how the shift to a focus on cloud-based business systems has impacted traditional analytics, what organizations are doing with their traditional on-prem data warehouses as they modernize, the challenges of working with and controlling data from multiple sources, and some of the new Microsoft data management technology that Mike is optimistic about for his clients. All right. Well, Mike Sims, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion. So much happening in sort of the transition from on-prem to cloud and all the decisions and the technology understanding that goes into that. I was hoping maybe we could just start with an introduction. I'm sure that a lot of our listeners will recognize your name, maybe recognize your voice or have seen you speak, because I know you've been presenting and working in this space for quite a while. Can you give us a little more background?
Yeah, sure. There's probably more people that haven't heard and seen me, though. But my name is Mike Sims, currently the Vice President of Digital Advisory and Data and Analytics at Columbus Global. I've been in the Dynamics Exapta space since it was called Darmgard Exapta back in about 2003 is when I started. Always been primarily focused on the back end, the database, the data warehousing, data migration, all of those topics that are kind of hidden behind the scenes because, the platform itself is very transactionally driven and functionally driven. So, all of my work tends to be in the background.
All right. Excellent. I don't think I knew quite how far back your experience went with the products, but that's great to know. And yeah, I know that it predates me because I think I saw you at one of the very first events I ever went to in the, early 2010s.
Yeah, I started it with version 2.3. So that's a while ago.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a low number. Awesome. Well, I wanted to start off with talking data warehouses.
Sure.
It's something that everyone's pretty much familiar with, I think, in terms of conceptually and what the basics of them are and why they've been so valuable over the years. They obviously predate the sort of prominence of cloud. Why have they worked so well in the past, and sort of where are they at today in your view?
Well, they've worked at varying levels, in my opinion, and the ones that work well tend to be very well designed reporters of data, if you will, and analyses of existing data from an authoritative data source or data sources. The ones that were built on-prem, primarily the main goal there and the efficiencies that were gained were by essentially de-siloing the data sets from the various different organizational components and putting it into one spot and having that one version of the truth, as it were. That concept still translates to the cloud, but it translates maybe a little differently in that your modeling might change a bit, and or you are democratizing data more to the end user, much more so than we did previously. And this actually requires, in my opinion, a little bit of a different approach. You do want to use that common data model, for example, but the IT function now is more on building curated data sets as opposed to reporting. I can remember coming into a couple of engagements or, even when I was, in the customer space itself, where we would have backlogs of reports. And now end users are much more capable and they have the tools that make it much easier for them to build reports themselves.
Curated data sets. Yeah, that's an interesting shift. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means for anyone who's not really sure the distinction? Yeah,
so a curated data set, a lot of times we would run into, let's pick on supply chain because supply chain is such a huge component of D365 now. Your supply chain manager or your procurement manager would have his own set of data that he would pull from the various data sets, and he would make sure that it was correct. And the difficulties, and this was a real world example, the difficulties in replicating that would come because he had certain filters on the data and our numbers weren't lining up. So IT's role then turns into, hey, we're going to give you all of the data with all of the correct joins and complexities kind of hidden away, if you will, so that you're just dealing with the data and the analysis that you need instead of the actual blocking and tackling of this very large, complex relational data set, so that you're given a view or a stored procedure or a data set itself in some way, shape, or form that you can then do your analysis on.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about maybe in the same idea when it comes to the traditional data professionals. What are some of the skills that go along with being able to provide that kind of support today?
Yeah, that's changed pretty dramatically. I call it upskilling. If you have SQL skills, on-prem T-SQL skills primarily, or if you're used to dealing with SQL Server Management Studio and you're dealing with SSIS and those types of tools and analysis services, they have Azure equivalents now. And for instance, with SQL Server, they do have Azure SQL Server where you're still dealing with, Management Studio. Essentially, it's just the cloud version of it. And you're dealing with the programming tools such as stored procedures and views that you are always used to. The ETL and ELT component of it, however, has kind of changed, and it's turned into more of a data engineering role, which we were always kind of doing data engineering, but we were doing it within the confines of something like SSIS, for instance. Now we're using tools like Azure Data Factory and maybe Azure Databricks to mold that data, to shape that data, to orchestrate our data flows and getting that into the various different end components that we need in order to perform analysis. So the skill sets themselves, I really see two broad areas where this is branching off into. One broad area is in the visualization tools and dealing with things like Power BI and those Power Platform tools that for larger scale engagements that aren't necessarily at the individual level. And then the other area that I see, and of course there's many more, but the other main area that I see right now is data engineering, where you're dealing with how to get the data out of all of these different systems and matching it up and then presenting those curated data sets or those data sets to the people to consume them.
And when it comes to having those data sets in cloud services, what are some of the differences there? I know that it's a whole different way of pricing. It's a whole different way of sort of managing change over time.
That's kind of a whole class that I'd like to take one of these times if Microsoft ever stops developing and creating new things to do. But that's not going to happen, of course. So you have Data Lake, which is gaining vast popularity within the user space, and that's being driven primarily by Microsoft in the D365 space as they drive towards this export to Data Lake feature with the Synapse on top of it, which is another tool that we'll probably talk about here. But that data lake allows you to store not only structured data, the data that we're used to seeing from OLTP systems, from tables and columns and rows and columns and so forth, into these JSON files or these XML structures or these Parquet structures, whatever you want to use for, again, whatever your application usage is going to be, whether that be machine learning or analytics or reporting or any combination of those things. So data lake is adopting rapidly. And you still do see a lot of folks that want to drive their data into what we would consider the norm, which was tables, rows, and columns in an Azure SQL database. That concept has been adopted as BYOD, or bring your own database, essentially. And that tends to be much more entity driven as opposed to table driven. So again, that Microsoft has kind of taken some of the complexity out of all of these table joins and these nested views and so forth, and built into these compound entities or even these simple entities, so that we don't have to worry about that as IT or as end users. It does still have its own complexities in there. There's still development involved, of course, but that's essentially the two major areas of storage that I see. It's still SQL Server and now Data Lake.
And in terms of Data Lake, how is Microsoft doing with sort of moving that ahead? As you said, they are, and I have seen this too, that they are the ones sort of putting that vision out there and trying to move it ahead, technically aligned with the Dynamics products, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of reasons why they want to have things in a data lake as opposed to in structured storage. And I think it just has to do really with exponential data growth. You look anywhere, and I mean, Seagate and these other storage companies have to just be, doing backflips because their products are being, used and consumed in larger and larger quantities and larger increments. So that they have to be very happy from a storage capacity side. But what Microsoft is really trying to drive with this data lake concept is, hey, this data lake is rather cheap. When you look at it compared to SSD or any other type of mounted storage, it's really cheap compared to those. So I can store a terabyte of data for about $100 a month. That's really, really, efficient from a storage standpoint. I don't know, to be honest with you, because I don't really get to follow a lot of the technological breakthroughs that they make. It just seems like they've stabilized that data lake concept, and it is being used and adopted for a number of applications, again, across the spectrum of analytics.
Yeah, and we might come back to that a bit. I wanted to move on to, I guess, a related theme, which is the topic of legacy data warehouses. And when people are planning for the cloud, what's really happening when it comes to figuring out what to do with legacy data warehouse solutions?
Well, I mean, a lot of companies don't really, that I've encountered right now, don't really consider a legacy data warehouse an issue until it needs to be an issue. It's kind of like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. I've got all of these reports and analyses that work for what I need for right now, so I don't need to really confront that. And we have limited budgets, and so that's understandable when you're looking at an investment into an ERP platform or an upgrade or anything like that. However, what I've been seeing with some of the companies that are engaging with us is that we have this decade-plus old data warehouse that was structured either around, say, AX 2009 or AX 2012 RTM. So it doesn't even really have the newest data structures involved in there. And of course, we change those data structures. But the point being, I really see a couple of different areas that they're going on. It's really like a lift and shift with the existing data structures. We're not really going to address anything new. We're just going to get it off-prem and into the cloud. And then we can go back and kind of retrofit that new schema for our staging and our relational as needed, because then we're going to come up with new analytics and data structures that we're going to need. So once we do all of those things and figure those things out, then we'll go back and address the schema issue. The second issue that I see is really, it kind of took me a little bit by surprise, but people are actually backboarding. I don't know if that's a term. I guess we'll make it up right now, but backboarding to the on-prem system from the cloud. Using the cloud data, but changing that data structure from whatever structure it is right now, let's say D365, down to something that they had that will soon be legacy, for instance, GP, NAV, or AX 2009. They've got all this investment in this data warehouse on-prem. They want to maintain it. They just want their new transactional data to come back into it. So the backboarding I didn't anticipate that. I thought people would want to get everything up into the cloud, but hey, that's another option. And really the third option that I see out there is, hey, we've got this legacy data warehouse with legacy data structures, and our business has changed a lot. The analytics, a lot of them still pertain, but we really have, I call it Band-Aided or MacGyvered, if you will, the data structures to meet our new business structures. So we need to go back through and do a real comprehensive redesign. That, of course, is the bigger effort with all of these different things. So when you see that one, it really needs to get the business people involved and the IT people involved. That upskilling then comes into play because the people that are used to maintaining the on-prem need to learn how to use the tools that are in the cloud now.
All right. So yeah, a lot of potential ways these legacy on-prem data warehouses might get handled when the need arises. And I'm surprised too about that strategy of backboarding or whatever you called it. That does surprise me. From my perspective, I certainly understand the logic of let's take all our historical data from our legacy ERP that we're moving away from, make sure that's all retained in a data warehouse. And maybe we'll talk about this, but I think Microsoft's even supporting that to an extent with some of its own legacy ERPs when it's trying to entice people to move to the cloud, that you can move that in there, even if you then delete get rid of the core database, the operational database, you retain that legacy data and then you can move forward. That source is always there. But this is different. Let's keep that even going. Let's just keep feeding data into it. We're happy with it. Is that like a skills thing? Like we have data architects?
No, I think it has to do with an investment. And, some of these customers have 300, 400, 500 reports written against this. And again, it's not broke, don't fix it. It meets my business need right now. And I don't want to put that kind of investment of time, effort, and money into a new data warehouse. Just let's keep the one we've got working and just change the data sources basically and conform it.
Maybe this would be a good time, because I think we've kind of touched on it a couple of times, but like you mentioned Azure Synapse, and there's Azure Synapse Link. Was that what you were referring to before as one of the ways that Microsoft's making it easier to get data into cloud data warehouses or storage?
Well, what Synapse is really designed to do is larger data sets, and it's designed also to be kind of an all-in-one toolkit, if you will, with the orchestration of the data, the working with the data similar to what you would do with SQL Server Management Studio on-prem. And then also the reporting of the data, they do have ways to work within Power BI within the Studio or within the Synapse interface. One of the nice things that I haven't actually done this myself, but I've seen it demoed, and I've done a little bit of research on it, so I can't go into it in a whole lot of detail, is that it also allows you to utilize machine learning code from within the Synapse interface. So you don't actually have to go out and do all this machine learning high-end stuff. You can do it directly from within Synapse with some SQL code by executing machine learning, experiments within that data set. So it really allows for, kind of end-to-end data type of manipulation, analysis, and reporting within that interface.
Mm-hmm. Are there any cases or projects that you've been working on where some of these demands have come into play recently?
Not from the machine learning side, but definitely from the Synapse side of things, where we have been moving primarily Synapse serverless. We haven't really had one that required the full, if you will, server-driven Synapse itself, because that's a much more expensive option. And that's really, again, a data volume issue. If you're under a terabyte, you probably don't need to have that full Synapse. You can get away with serverless and size it appropriately. So we have a number of customers right now that we're working with that on, where we're working with some tabular models and some that are just working with the data sets that are coming out of D365, and we're writing reports against them.
So it's coming out of D365 into a data lake.
Yep.
Yeah. Processing data from multiple sources, is that a different challenge than you've dealt with in the past, or is it just?
No. We have multiple data sources. That's usually the norm. There are some companies that have one data source, and it's usually their AX or their ERP system. But more and more companies are getting much more complex. You see IoT systems coming into play. You see, of course, a lot of Excel. 80 or 90% of your data is probably driven in Excel with a lot of these companies, either exporting data from their ERP system and doing some type of manipulation anyways. Very popular with budgeting, for example. And then also you see MES systems, PIM systems, all these other different systems that maybe D365 doesn't quite meet the requirements of the product management, so they get a PIM system or something like that, or they have some type of engineering system that's external to help them with their processes within the organization.
I was just thinking, as you were explaining that, I was thinking about the work Microsoft has sort of done over time to try to improve its own story when it comes to its own Dynamics apps, of making data, the one source of truth idea, work. Make it work, make it so that if you're in one app, you're seeing the same and accurate data that is being worked on in another app, maybe changed by other types of people doing other types of jobs that apply to the same information. I don't know, what's the real world sort of outlook on sort of one version of the truth and authoritative data from your perspective?
Yeah, well, data's messy by definition. And that's what a lot of what these big systems are for, is we've got this one large system that kind of runs our business. And so we want to have processes in place that make sure that our data is clean, so that it's actionable, so that we can do things with it from a legacy perspective, from an analysis perspective, and from a real-time perspective. And I think that the toolkit that we're presented from, let's just stay within the D365 space for now, has been really built out in a very, very smart way to pull all of these different parts of the business into one place. So there's not a lot of redundancy. There's not a lot of potential for, if you put the proper controls in place, of course, for bad data to get put in the system. You're always going to have I call it fat fingering, where people make a mistake on typing and some things get out there. And that's very common, for instance, with addresses and customers and people's names. You can have things written 3 or 5 different ways. I don't know if you've ever encountered that with a company that maybe you've gone to their website a couple of times and you put your name in slightly different, and you all of a sudden have 2 different accounts. So that requires some type of data governance, of course, and some type of structure to help with that. And Microsoft is really trying to make it easy to enforce that. But the system itself has become so normalized that it's really difficult to make those types of mistakes, again, with the proper process and governance in place. As far as one version of the truth is concerned, again, I view the data warehouse as a reporting system. So if there is an issue with the data quality, that needs to go back to the source system, which let's just say with D365, and we fix that data at the source. If you go a little bit broader and you're dealing with authoritative data from multiple systems, how do you govern that? That gets into much more of a governance question, and we need the business to come in and own those areas. For instance, products. IT should never own products. That's coming from maybe engineering or product management or wherever it would come within the organization. Same with bombs. That should be owned by the engineers that are designing the bombs. IT can, of course, help to design those a little bit more efficiently. Say, for instance, if you have 20 different bills of material that have 4 or 5 different minor tweaks in them, but they're essentially the same bomb, then maybe you have variant bombs in there instead. That's a different discussion, and that's more of a data structure issue. But overall, from an authoritative data position and a data point of view, that would become a governance within the company and how they would manage that.
Looking ahead, or maybe looking at as Microsoft continues to churn out updates and even new services or varied services, what else are you watching closely these days?
Keep a lookout for the new reporting suite that's going to be coming out. I think it's called Project Comacina. I had seen that as the name. Don't hold me to it. I don't know if they've changed it or if it's going to be new. But of course, the export to data lake was codenamed Project Como. And that went GA, I think, at the end of November last year. And it's catching on like wildfire. I'm in the Yammer group, and we have weekly calls on that, and just a ton of really good stuff within that organization and good feedback from Microsoft. And they are taking the real world examples back to the what ifs, and they're trying to incorporate those very, very well. The product managers and the program managers there, I think, are doing great with that. I had seen last year in the third quarter, I thought it was a demo of this suite of reports that's coming out that's going to be very targeted and very robust. And so that is the one area that I'm very excited about.
Interesting. Yeah. And when you're talking about data lake export, you're talking about specifically D365?
Well, in this case, Project Como is export to D365. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. Yeah, that's right. Actually very interesting to know that there's that much activity internally for your team and from what you're seeing from Microsoft. For customers, what are you advising them to, when it comes to the skills of their teams, what are you advising them to really ramp up on?
Yeah, that's really good. If you have a SQL person, for example, that is like, okay, what do I do now that SQL is going away? And that was where we were about 3 or 4 years ago. I would advise them to get into the data engineering program. I think the DP200 is a good example of where to start to see where your skills will apply and then where you have some gaps that you need to upskill into. Primarily around Data Factory and Spark SQL, those types of tool sets, which are Spark SQL language is very, very similar to T-SQL. It does have some syntactic differences, but for the most part, it is SQL. There are other tools that are out there that we use occasionally that we use on an as-needed basis, but that is the main tool for SQL people. If you're a report writer right now, what I'm recommending for our customers is that you get familiar with Power BI, not only the desktop version for the analytical reports, which are the visualizations, but also for Report Builder, which is the replacement for SQL Server reporting services. There's going to be a lot of need for that type of skill, I think, because as we talked about earlier, with all of these on-prem data warehouses and reporting systems, there's going to need to be something, hey, we have to replace these reports. How do we do that? What's our path? How do we determine whether we should go with an analytical report versus a tabular report? That's kind of, subjective, but there's some guidelines around that, I guess. It's rules of thumb, if you will.
Yeah, and kind of going back to one of the early points you made, expectations are that it's not necessarily the same people who used to be building reports for you. You might be expected to, for people who are looking to build those skills, it's a great area where there probably will be more responsibility, more expectations that you can do those sorts of things and sort of the roles of the future.
Yeah, exactly. I have, for instance, a report that we use internally to kind of run our business in the United States. And there is one data set, but it has 13 different reports that are built off of it. And that just is a curated data set that has all of the data the way that people need to see it. And then we go about and we customize as needed.
Well, Mike, it's been great getting a chance to hear from you, hear what you're seeing. We'll have to do it again because you have some great experiences and customers' stories out there that really kind of cut through what the technology can really do. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
This has been another episode of the MSDW podcast. My thanks once again to Mike Sims for joining. For more information about Columbus and their data and analytics solutions, visit them online to read an ebook, see presentations, and more. The link is in the show notes. And that's it for this episode. If you want to reach me, send an email to jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com. And for all of our updates, please do follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off. Bye.